welcome back to Otaku no Video. As always, thank you very much for joining me for part 3 of my video primer series on the Gainax Anime Studio. Now, when last we left, Evangelion had finished, for certain definitions of finishing, and left the otaku community kind of bowled over and clutching their pillows and crying, because it was a very controversial series, controversial ending, and some controversial movies. So, Gainax then, well, they made His and Her Circumstances, which I will talk about. We didn't really talk about much in the previous videos. We'll talk about it now. His and Her is this shoujo manga, was a shoujo manga about high school kids. And the creator of Evangelion came back to make that anime. And it is a lower budget anime than most other series at the time. This was at the point when anime was getting smaller and smaller budgets. So there are times when His and Her, frankly, looks cheap. But they do a very good job with the budget. You can tell they learned from what they did with the instrumentality sequence in Evangelion and applied it to doing effective animation techniques with limited budget in His and Her Circumstances. And they did this really solid, really effective sort of high school romance story. Although it's got romance, drama, character development, comedy, all those things all working in one show. It's a really effective show if you're kind of into that kind of thing. And it's got goofy comedy as well as really heart-wrenching stuff. And kind of remarkable that it was made by Anno, who seemed to be so depressed up to that point. Anyway, so His and Her Circumstances came out, and meanwhile, something interesting happened to Gainax. Basically, and I'm grossly paraphrasing here, one of the guys at Gainax hauled in a computer, slammed it down on the desk at work, gathered everyone over and said, "Look, you've got to see this." And he showed them one of the early porn games that were being made in Japan. And usually these are like strip mahjong, strip poker type stuff. Some of them had stories though. And the idea was you'd see a drawing of a girl, then you'd have a little conversation with them, whatever. And as you had the conversation, she'd basically undress. Or we'd play a game and strip poker kind of stuff. And they started getting into this in actually probably the early 90s as well as here. But this was a big revelation because this guy basically said, "Look, here's what they do, and their drawings suck. The artwork is really, really poor, and the coding is simple." I mean, especially with these conversational games, it's just menus and changing the pictures. It's very, very simple. So they said, "Look, we can take our artistic talent and apply it to this." So they started making Evangelion-themed games and Nadia-themed games and all these various things, and really making money off of their properties because there really were no electronic rights in the contract at that point. So even though Gainax wasn't making money off of their early shows because of their poor contracting, those contracts didn't state you can't make games off of these things. So Gainax was able to generate a lot of profit off of these games and electronic things. A lot of them having sexual content with their own characters, which is awesome. Anyway, so from the anime perspective, Gainax, besides His and Her Circumstances, in the late 90s basically just did these little minor OVA things. A thing called Modern Love Silliness, this sort of ecchi comedy called Uruchuban Ebichu, and other things like that. And they wouldn't really do anything else remarkably anime-wise until the year 2000, an OVA called Furikuri, or FLCL. And one of the people at my History of the Anime panel at Otakon pointed out that Furikuri could be seen as the inauguration of the anime tendency towards postmodernism, and I totally agree. And if you're out there, please introduce yourself. Furikuri is this very odd story set in this sort of quasi-science fictional world, although it's very much a real world, but there's science fiction elements, and it's very postmodern. It references itself, it references anime, it references manga. There's this whole running gag about Lupin III, all these various things, and it doesn't really make much sense, but it's not trying to. It is this experience. It's kind of like a drug trip. You're just sort of watching things happen. And in fact, there's a sequence that is basically an animated manga. It's panels of a manga that we sort of zip through. Weird. And very self-referential and very Gainaxian, if you will. And this got a lot of people interested and riled up. And it was very remarkable. It had a high animation budget because Gainax now was trying to make enough money to be able to pour a lot of money into things like this. They also finally completed the frickin' thing, so it actually had an ending. Although, again, the ending, the ending was weird, but no less weird than the rest of the, or no more weird than the rest of the show. So folks were kind of okay with that. So Furry Curry was a big thing for Gainax, and it showed that they still had it after Evangelion His and Her, even though it had been a couple of years. Unfortunately, they would go from this to lesser and lesser things in their later works. And in the next video in the series, I'm going to talk about those later works and what was going on with Gainax and kind of where they went and where they are now. So stay tuned.